Politically Speaking. I'm Elizabeth Bennion, Chancellor's Professor of Political Science and Director of Community Engagement and the American Democracy Project at Indiana University, South Bend. Joining us today is Eric Doden, Republican candidate for Indiana Governor. Doden previously served as president of the Indiana Economic Development Corporation under Governor Mike Pence. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good to be here.
I would like to start by asking you about your top priorities if you are elected governor. What would those top priorities be and how would you address them?
I think what's going to be really important for us going forward is attracting and retaining talent. And you talk to business owners and leaders all over the state of Indiana, and they don't have enough talent to grow their business or to grow their community. And so having a 92 county strategy where every community has the opportunity to prosper is going to be very important to me. I grew up in small towns, Butler and Auburn, and we're the first candidate to have a plan for our small towns where 2.5 million people live, called the Indiana Main Street Initiative, where we think we can restore small towns top to bottom. But also protecting the vulnerable is going to be important. That's why I have the first candidate in the country to have a zero-cost adoption policy where we can have our 13,000 kids in foster care, be part of a loving home, and then help the parents and the family not just pay for the adoption, but the aftercare. So these are going to be top priorities that we're going to focus on under my administration.
So it sounds like your approach then is really to empower local governments and parents to do a lot of that work that needs to be done, really try to decentralize the work across the state.
Yeah, when we've seen successful communities, they've been because local leaders have the bold vision for the community. And we've really emphasized this as we've traveled the state of Indiana over the last 3 years, that we need to be a good partner to you as state government, but you really need to have the vision for your family or for your community locally, and then allow us to be a good partner to you in that vision. And so I think that message is resonating, and people are beginning to get excited about having a bold vision for their community.
Now, how does your past leadership of the Indiana Economic Development Corporation play into your candidacy and your vision for the future of the state?
Yeah, I mean, it was such a great opportunity. Here I'm a boy from Butler, Indiana, and Auburn, to be able to be one of the lead salesmen for the state of Indiana is what I like to call it. But also I got to travel the entire state, and we had the opportunity to have meetings, back in 2013 to 15 with all over the state of Indiana, with people like telling us their concerns, their challenges, and that's what regional cities, I was the architect of regional cities, if you remember that, and kind of getting regions to work well together. And now the Indiana Main Street Small Towns is to us the next step in the process of making sure that we don't just have 13 strong regions, but that we have strong communities, small towns and even medium-sized towns and large cities. We all need to be successful in this journey, and that's all of our kind of programs and our ideas are around that, making sure everyone has a chance to prosper.
As someone who lives here in Michiana and northern Indiana, we certainly have seen a lot more cooperation among the regions based on that program and that push in that direction. And I suppose the fact that the push comes with dollars doesn't hurt.
Well, yeah, I think the idea was, look, everyone wanted the state to invest in them. And we said, okay, we're willing to invest, but you need to have a plan that you're all in line with. I've said to many communities that the biggest threat to economic development or growth in your community is lack of alignment. So when people get together and say, okay, here's the strategy, here's the plan, we're aligned, then that's where you see success happen. And I'll give you an example. In Fort Wayne, when I got back there in 2015, they asked me to lead the chamber to take Fort Wayne to a nationally recognized economy. That's what they wanted. And so the first step was we had a $30 million plan. That was it for a town of 300,000 people. We stood up 10 months later and announced a $650 million plan that everyone bought into, they all got behind, and the press thought that we had, this was 10x what we'd ever done in 10 years, because we said it was a 10-year plan. But we closed $400 million in under 3 years, really shocking everybody. And now Fort Wayne in 2023, 7 years later, was just ranked the 32nd best place to live in the country by U.S. News & World Report. We want that to happen in all 13 regions.
Now, one of the things that people talk about a lot as they think about the economy is, of course, taxes. There have been some debates about what tax policy should look like. What do you think of this proposal to get rid of the income tax, and what reforms would you support?
Well, I think we're going to focus on initially, I think the most important tax that we hear about is property taxes, especially for seniors. When you have seniors that are telling me that they could lose their home because there's been the largest tax increase in property taxes, 15+% in 20 years. And so you have these people that are on fixed incomes that are like, Eric, I don't know how I'm going to pay my property tax bill, especially if it keeps going up. So we have a proposal to fix or cap the property taxes for seniors. We're coming out with some explanation behind that. They'll still pay like their property tax, that they were paying at, let's say 65, but then it will be fixed, for the remainder of the time they own that house in order that they can plan. We don't think that any senior should lose their house over, a rapid rise in property taxes, especially in light of inflation. So we really think it's important to protect our seniors there. And then, obviously income taxes have been a big discussion. We know we cannot axe the income tax. It puts an $8 billion hole in the budget, about 40%. So what we've said is we're going to work with the General Assembly. They're studying this right now. Obviously, they're the ones that dictate, this issue, but we have an influence there. We're going to work with them. And if they decide that we can, over time, in a fiscally responsible way, eliminate the income tax, we'll obviously be right there with them doing that. But if you're going to say we're going to axe a tax, you have to show that you're going to either reduce expenses by $8 billion or do a replacement tax. And if you're not doing one of those two things, it's not a legitimate plan. So we don't think a governor should make any promises they cannot keep. It's sort of a simple rule to me. And you should have a plan to work with the General Assembly to make sure that we have the best tax structure possible.
So your thought is if there was eventually an end to the income tax, it would have to happen slowly over time, or education, public safety, those kind of things would be harmed?
Yes. If you look at 50% of our budget's education. So if you're going to reduce, income by 40%, you're going to start, impacting every single category. Education, family services is 25% of the budget. So you look at these big budget numbers, and we don't think that you want to do something that would negatively impact families across the state of Indiana. So that's why you have to work with the General Assembly to make sure you have a good plan or a good replacement tax, something that's fair, that's sound. We're already one of the top states in the country for low taxes. So we want to protect our people and make sure that we have the best tax plan possible, and that's why you're going to have to partner with the General Assembly on this and really study it and make sure it's a good plan.
Now, Governor Holcomb actually deployed the Indiana National Guard to the southern border. As you look at that move, is that a political stunt? Is that a legitimate use of the state guard? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we have to do what we can to partner. Well, first of all, let me start the big picture. President Biden and the Congress have to do their job. They need to secure the border. In light of them not doing their job, I've said that we need to help our governors and support them in securing the border. That's where a lot of the drugs can come across. That's where, people that are coming in, up to 10 million people have come in since Biden's administration. So, and then we're hearing from communities where, this is beginning to impact their community. So it's a two-step process. One is let's secure the border. And the reason that we're sending the National Guard is it just takes manpower. You have to have enough manpower to secure the border. But then coming back to the state, we need to make sure that our law enforcement have the tools, the training, the resources. Specifically, I think a governor is really going to help in terms of recruiting people into, law enforcement work. Right now, we're having challenges where we might have, 5 or 10 law enforcement jobs open, and it used to be you'd have 50 applicants, and now you're barely getting enough applicants, if that, to fill the jobs. So trying to help recruit people into law enforcement and public service, and then making sure they have the tools, the training, the resources to protect people.
What is it that a governor could do to help recruit people in that way?
Well, you travel, as governor at least, I will travel the state of Indiana. We'll be meeting with people in high schools. We'll be meeting with people all over the state. We'll have an opportunity to share opportunities, inspire people to take on public service. It's a calling. And sometimes, like, you're just exposed to it from people in leadership who are talking positively about the calling can cause people to say, hey, I want to look into that. I want to potentially be a part of something bigger than myself where I'm serving people.
Now, one of the things that the legislature has to do is balance a lot of different issues. The economy, we've always talked about, that is always top of mind for many people. But sometimes the legislature tackles headline-grabbing so-called culture war issues like transition healthcare, gender transition healthcare for minors, transgender athletes, book bans in schools. To what extent do you think the legislature should focus on those kind of issues versus other kinds of issues? It seems to me that Governor Holcomb has mostly put his focus on economic issues. As governor, what would you encourage the legislature to focus on?
What we're going to do, make sure that we protect the vulnerable. So we're going to protect our children, make sure that there's appropriate material in the schools, make sure that we do the best we can to protect the vulnerable. We're going to focus on things like zero-cost adoption, for example, like I explained, where you have these 13,000 kids that would love to experience a loving home. And a lot of people want to adopt, but they also know there's a high cost to not just adoption, but the aftercare. And so by having this adoption fund that will not only help pay for adoption, but help pay for the aftercare, it really empowers people to say, all right, I'm willing to take on the responsibility of bringing this child into our home and loving on this child. And these are the kind of ideas that I think almost everyone can get on board with, get excited about, that we want to focus on. We want to not just be pro-life. I mean, I'm ardently pro-life. I've made that clear. I think it's a human rights issue and a religious issue to me. But I also know that these other issues of zero-cost adoption gets everyone on board with that. I've had my pro-choice friends say, I really admire that you're pro-family, pro-mother, pro-child, and that's the kind of administration that we want to be, is not just pro-life. We're going to be pro-life, but pro-mother, pro-family, and pro-child, and strengthen the family.
It's interesting, folks on both sides of the aisle have talked about adoption subsidies. I know Democratic Senator David Niezgodski keeps trying to push it as well, but it doesn't quite get the traction it needs to go all the way. It sounds like you think that having a strong focus on that from the governor's mansion could make that difference.
Right, and I think, you have to put resources to it. So this whole concept that we're advocating for is a tax credit concept, where when you make a donation to the adoption fund, you'll get a 50% tax credit on your state income taxes, and then the rest of it can be deducted federally. So in simple terms, it will cost you about 30 cents on the dollar to make a contribution to the adoption fund. We've seen how that's been very effective with vouchers and school choice in terms of funding that. This will be very effective in funding a zero-cost adoption fund that will then help these families who are loving on these kids.
So ordinary Hoosiers would be able to vote with their dollars
Correct.
while getting a tax benefit for
Correct.
doing so. Now, of course, Indiana does have mentioned being pro-life, one of the most restrictive abortion laws in the country. Do you think the current law that allows exceptions for the health or life of the mother, rape or incest very early on in the gestational period, is that, or fetal abnormality that is fatal, is that about the right balance in your mind? Is it not restrictive enough, too restrictive? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I've said from day one, I'm ardently pro-life. We're going to have a culture of life, and we're going to try to protect children, protect mothers, protect the vulnerable. So I've just kept it at, there. I think our focus needs to also now be on things like zero-cost adoption and making sure that we're giving the resources. I think we have a lot of issue with infant mortality, and so I think we need to focus on trying to do the best we can to make sure that we help those mothers, and then do things with zero-cost adoption and help strengthen families. That's going to be really the focus of my administration. The law is the law. I think the law has been passed, and I think that's pretty much settled. I think people have gotten into, where that is settled law. We're going to focus on some of these other things that will strengthen families and help mothers.
What about IVF? Is that something, or access to birth control, is that something the legislature should tackle, or you'd like to see them tackle under your administration, or did you want to keep that focus on infant mortality and adoption?
Well, I've said very clearly that we want people to have children. We think we are going to work with the General Assembly to protect IVF and make sure it's available. We want to have stronger families. We know that this is in the best interest of people. People, for all of us who have had family members and friends who have struggled with fertility, we know that how difficult that can be for people. And so we want to have laws that help people have children, but we also want to go further and make sure that we're strengthening families and giving people the best opportunity to be successful in life. And that's going to be the focus of how we lead.
Last question on that then. Should the state then look into embryo adoption policies if they support IVF?
Well, I think we're open to all those ideas and thoughts and concepts. There's a lot of issues here that have to be thought through, with all kinds of people at the table, and so we're just going to listen and continue to try to understand more about this topic and more about some of the issues at hand, and do the best we can to lead well through it.
All right. Well, speaking of families, the education of children is important for all of us in a society, and of course important to the parents of children who want a good future for their children. Indiana has struggled with reading scores. Do you think the state is doing all it can to make sure that our children are well educated and literate?
What I've tried to help people understand is we have a constitutional obligation to educate our kids. It's enshrined in our Constitution. And I also think we have a moral obligation to educate our children well. This is the future of our entire state, is educating our children. So we've actually done a couple things that we've come out with plans. We have a plan for a teacher investment program. We have a teacher crisis and shortage all over the state of Indiana, especially in our small towns. And you have the situation where you have these kids that need to be educated and not enough teachers. So our teacher investment program would make teachers income tax and property tax free. It's about a $5,000 pay raise for the average teacher. Now people have asked me, well, Eric, why are we doing that for teachers? Well, by giving it directly to teachers, the unions and also administration doesn't take a cut. This goes right to the teacher. It's invested in the teacher. This will be, by the way, for both public and private. So it really is an investment in our teachers. Because we know that those teachers, I know for myself, my teachers made a big impact in my life in terms of me being who I am today, and so that's going to be important. The other thing that we've said is we have $1 billion coming free in the budget due to good fiscal management, and we put a stake in the ground saying that we need to have early childhood education fully funded, universal for our kids. We have a white paper on that as well, explaining that whole program. Because we think this will help us with the third grade reading issue and just making sure that we just keep pursuing excellence in education all the way through. Because I think we have a constitutional but moral obligation to give our kids the best possible opportunity to be educated that we can.
It's interesting, the legislators that we have on the program have talked about the fact that they've given more money to the school systems to decide what to do with so that they can increase that teacher pay, but some of the teachers say we're not seeing it. It sounds like you're taking an entirely different approach and giving it directly to the teachers.
Right, that's why we thought it was important just to give it, this is directly to the teachers, benefits them directly. There's nowhere it can go through to kind of get diluted or lost. It goes right to the teachers. And I think it was very important from my perspective to tell the teachers how much we care about them.
Now, one of the things that happened in Indiana was that there was a law passed to allow teachers to carry firearms in school. So are you supportive of that policy? And are there any things about Indiana's gun laws that you'd like to see changed?
Well, I'm a big Second Amendment rights person. I don't believe that guns are the issue. I believe whenever you make something the issue that's not the issue, you lose out in the root cause. So I think we have to have more resources on mental health and more resources on making sure we strengthen families and strengthen people. A lot of times when people are misusing, guns or anything else, it's because of a root issue in their life that they need to deal with, that we need to get better at, protecting the vulnerable and giving them the resources they need to break addictions. For those of us who have had families or friends in addictions, we know it's a very complicated, arduous process. People that are trying to break addiction generally takes 3 or 4 times before they break that addiction. And so you have to have wraparound services. You have to have people that help them. The family sometimes really runs out of gas, so to speak, after 1 or 2 times because they've been experienced of some of the deceit or stealing from the family, these types of things that really are challenging for families. So we think there's a whole host of things that we need to focus on when it comes to mental health and providing the resources and some of the training and then making sure that there are some really creative things that are happening all over the state, making sure other regions know what's happening in each of the regions so that they can improve their addiction counseling and services.
Sounds like you actually agree with the lieutenant governor and one of your political opponents for the primary, then, that there needs to be more emphasis on addiction and mental health services.
Right, and I think one of the things that we're also advocating is, as we strengthen communities and give people more opportunities, one of the things that gives us dignity is work. Meaningful work gives us all dignity. So as you begin to take your small towns, and in most of these small towns, in our experience, about 80% of their building stock is uninhabitable. Well, that's a lost opportunity. And so when we go in and restore these buildings top to bottom, make them modern, get them elevators, they still have the historic look that we all love, but now they're usable. So that gives you housing, and it's affordable housing, which is a big deal. As you know, there's a big need for affordable housing in our state, but it also gives you these opportunities for small business growth. And this small business growth is where people then, find meaningful employment and meaningful work that gives them the opportunity to focus on things that give them meaning, rather than, maybe addictions that are causing them challenges and problems in life. And so these are the kind of things where sometimes we kind of like treat things like they're in a silo when they're very, very much related. As you begin to restore communities and improve them, as you begin to invest in education, as you begin to work with local leaders and empower them to a bold vision, as you begin to give meaningful work to people, what we hope is that leads to less mental health issues and addiction.
And more public safety, it sounds like you're saying. So just to loop back just 1 second to actual gun policy, you would continue the red flag laws for people known to be a danger, or that the court deems to be a danger to themselves and others, but otherwise stick with permitless carry and most of the other laws that are currently in place.
Yeah, we're going to stick with laws that, that both protect people but also that protect gun rights.
Right.
And then I would also say, though, that one of the things that the foundation of this country is our commitment to law and order. It's foundational. It's why, we're 25% of the world's economy when we have 360 million people. And so I think, making sure that law enforcement has the right tools, the right training, the right support, and that the people that are conducting criminal behavior are held accountable. Those are big issues, and they will continue to be something that's top of mind for us as we lead the state of Indiana.
So continue to listen to law enforcement and whether or not they think there are any adjustments needed, while also listening to other people as well.
Right. And then if you have, prosecutors, we call them rogue prosecutors, but that aren't enforcing, the law, then, we have some plans for that to make sure that, there's a prosecutorial review board, and that we can make sure that people aren't just getting out of jail and then committing, bigger crimes, which is some of the things that's been happening. As they get arrested, we have them, and locked up, but then we let them out on a small bond, and then they they commit a bigger crime. These are the kind of things that, that we need to make sure that we enforce the law.
So we've talked already about the importance of education. One of the ways to keep people off the streets is keep them in schools, and then ideally to also get them some training or college after high school. What are your thoughts on the reduction in the number of people going to college, and how would you open up or try to encourage more people to go to college and also pursue other kinds of post-secondary education?
Well, there's some really creative stuff going on right now with that. And one of the things that we're looking at is, do we give more flexibility and freedom to high school seniors to do internships? So I've been really promoting with business leaders all over the state. I've been asking them, like, how many of you go to the high schools and make sure the kids understand the really cool things that you do at your business just down the road? And so they're getting better at educating the kids and our high schoolers as to what opportunities are available. Then you have really creative things like the Jim Kelly School in Fort Wayne, where these kids are able to go in and to use computers to learn how to weld. So they can figure out, they get a welding score, and they can figure out, am I really good at welding? By the way, I was not as good as I hoped to be. There also is machines now that they can actually maneuver heavy equipment, so they can get a flavor of what I enjoy. There's so many opportunities in construction and heavy equipment, and very good high-wage jobs, sometimes six-figure jobs. And so there's all these great opportunities. We just need to do a better job, I think, of educating our kids about all these opportunities that we have, and then giving them a pathway to discover for themselves what their passion is.
We only have a short time period. Would you support looking at universal pre-K or mandatory kindergarten, or is that not the direction you think we need to go to get these kids started, right?
Well, I said that we're putting that stake in the ground for early childhood education. I think, again, we have $1 billion coming free because of good fiscal management, and that money could then be used for early childhood education, which I think, is another step in the journey of having excellence in education in Indiana.
Now, in the final 10 seconds, what is one thing you'd like all voters to know about you as they consider their choice in the primary election?
Well, I would like them to go to dodenforindiana.com and look at our plans, give us feedback. Every plan that you see there that's in writing, and we're the only candidate that has a plan in writing for the state of Indiana, has been improved by voters all over the state. We love your feedback. We love to have you involved and engaged. I've said this many times. This is not going to be just one person who improves the lives of 7 million people. It's going to take a team, and we're going to need a team of people to lead in the state of Indiana, and we'd love to have you join our team.
Thank you so much for being here. And that is all the time we have for this week's Politically Speaking. I want to thank our guests, Eric Doden, Republican candidate for Governor of Indiana. I'm Elizabeth Bennion, reminding you that it takes all of us to make democracy work. We'll see you next time.
This WNIT local production has been made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.